Crimpy's Fishing Show.
It's Newstalk ZB. Happy Saturday morning. Welcome back. Once again, I'm Regan and the saltier dog himself, Mr. Daryl Crimp. Fishing with Crimpy, it is the time. How you doing, Crimpy?
Good morning. Well, I'm no longer salty. It's all been diluted.
Oh, yeah, it has.
The water of the last week has thinned out the salt from the veins.
Yep.
And replaced them with silt.
Well, we certainly had let's say, an adventurous week at the fishing paper, didn't we?
Bit of drama. It's good though. I mean, our offices got blown out, so we've had to relocate from home. Silt everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's the old story that no matter how bad it is for you, there's always somebody that has it worse.
That's right. The whole of Wakatu Industrial Estate was taken out, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, well, I realised something was up when I saw a trout go past the window.
Did you catch it?
No.
Useless.
It was heading in the wrong direction. Well, it brought me back to thinking last week, I think it was, you were talking about how you like wet weather. And as a kid in Westport, you thought the best time to go whitebaiting was in a flood.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't react at the time because my synapses just stopped firing. Yeah. But you seriously chose... Wouldn't it be hard to drag the scoop net against a flood?
Oh, no, not when you got muscles like mine. That's what all of this is, muscle.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that part. The only muscle that's working and use your tongue. All right, I remember a story. When I was living in Westport, actually, we had a major flood down there which went up above Hawke's Crag.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that happened quite frequently. So floods, some people could be forgiven for thinking that the current floods are sort of out of the ordinary. Wow, how did that happen? But they do happen quite regularly through history. I remember I almost got lost in the Buller River in a flood. I almost got swept to sea.
Did you?
Yeah, I was thinking trout fishing at the time because everybody thought, oh, the Buller's in flood, we've got to hunker down, put the sandbags out. And I thought, oh, chance for a trout. Yeah. Not that I went fishing in a flooded river after trout.
Okay.
But there's a river up from the Ohikanui. I thought there was a bit of a backwater up round the corner, and I thought all these trout are going to pool in that backwater in this flood. So I'll sneak round there, flick a spinner, and Bob's your uncle. I'll be into these trout. Well, as I was heading around there, I had my dog Pepper in those days, bolting ahead, German short-haired pointer, and she come back, tongue lolling just like you are now, thinking all happy, here's Dad. Then as she spun round, her bum bumped against the side of a narrow track, and she slipped over this cliff and went way down into the flooded the Ohikanui. And of course, I didn't want to lose her, so over the side I went, hanging onto the crown ferns. And a little mate that I had with me, Michael Walter, he came down, and I got down, and Pepper was just holding herself against the current. And I managed to grab hold of her, reach down and grab her by the ear. And as I pulled her up, she caught a purchase on my gumboots.
Oh, no.
And she started scarpering. And Michael grabbed her and they forgot me and shot up to the top of the cliff. And I was left hanging by my teeth from a crown fern.
By your teeth?
Well, I exaggerate a little bit. Hanging by my fingers.
It's almost a bit Indiana Jones, that.
It was.
Eh?
Yeah. I wish they'd filmed it. But it was a bit scary when the gumboots filled up. But what happens in a flood? Well, this is what I want to know. What happens to the trout? Now, we have with us today to find out from Fish and Game, Reece Barrier. Good morning, Reece. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Daryl.
Now, people are dying to know what happens to trout in a flood, so we'll cover that in a moment. I loved your article in last month's issue about the pre-stag hunting for deer, the pre-raw hunting. Do you really take your boots off and hunt in your socks?
Well, that was the first time and it was successful, so I'll be doing it again. But I've heard stories about it, never done it myself, and this time it was the only option really where he was, and it worked. So
yeah, see, I've been hunting for a lot of years, 40 plus years, and it's amazing how you learn. Yeah. I assume that you've got a good wife. Does she darn your socks for you?
Well, it was actually bare feet.
Oh, really?
so I left the socks in the boots. So fortunately, there's no gorse where I hunt, so it was okay. It wouldn't be recommended in gorse country, but
that must be quite thrilling though, stalking in on a stag in that close proximity.
It was, and I because I've been doing it for sort of 25, 30 years now, I don't actually like hunting them when they're roaring because I sort of feel a bit sorry for the buggers. So pre-roar like that, when they're still fully alert and they've got all their senses about them and they're not overcome with blooming hormones, it's a real challenge, When they're roaring their head off, I just think, it's too easy now. I guess I've been doing it too long, but it was a thrill.
I think personally you're a wuss. I think anything that's overcome by hormones should be shot. But more of that in a moment. When we come back, we're talking trout fishing, and more in particular, what happens when you get a flood like we've had in the past week? Do they survive or do they get blown out to sea?
Welcome back and happy Saturday morning. Right, what's happening with the tides, Mr. Crimp?
Well, I imagine it's going to be quite murky around the top of the south, so if you want to catch some fish, you might have to go to where there's clearer water, but the high tides that you need to be aware of today if you're in Nelson is 10 to 10 a.m. That's a 4.3 metre tide. Havelock, your high tide 27 past 10, 3.2 metres. Crissel's high tide at 22 to 11, and that's a biggie at 4.6 today. Stevens, your high tide is 9 minutes past 10, 2.5 metres. Westport, high tide 20 past 12, it's a 3.3 metre. And Greymouth, just down the road, 12.08 in the afternoon, and that's 3.5 metre. So those are the tides for the day. Our special guest today, Reece from Fish and Game, the man who does not like shooting deer who have hormones. I can't believe that. I mean, I need everything in my advantage. So why don't you like them when they're roaring? Do you reckon they're dozy?
Oh, mainly because I got a fussy wife and she says they taste like urine, so she's not that keen.
Oh,
so.
see,
and I feel sorry for them.
And it gets back. You feel sorry.
To me, it's too easy now because they just stand there and look at you, and they seem to be fairly dumb when they're in that state, and it's sort of like it's easy to find them, and so I prefer the challenge of getting them pre-raw really, and they're better eating then too. So.
Yeah, well, I've seen some in the raw that I wouldn't say are that dumb. They disappear like ghosts. All right. Okay, moving on to trout. We had a lot of water in the last week or so. That big flood of last weekend that flooded all the offices and put a few people out of their homes. One could be forgiven for thinking that if you're a trout fisherman, it's all over. The trout would be blasted to kingdom come. Is that the case?
Well, I think if the rivers had got what we got here in Richmond and Stoke, it probably would be because it was horrendous. And it seemed to hit on Takaka Hill as well. But everywhere else, I looked at the flood flows today and everywhere else got off pretty lightly, really. So I think the Waimea River came up to about an 8-year flood return event, which is sort of semi-damaging to a fishery. So that will have been a bit hammered. The Lower Rawalka and the North Branch, they were up sort of 5 to 10 year return event. So here I was thinking that our nicely resetting fishery after a good October-November spawning was going to be thrashed again, but then the South Branch only got up to half annual flood level. So it really depends on the size really and the speed that they come up.
So you have a system of measuring floods, so you can measure them pretty quickly. And when you're saying that you're talking an 8-year return flood or a 10-year, can you explain that to me?
Yeah, sorry, Daryl. That's from Tasman.
No, don't apologise. I mean, apologise to the deer. Feel sorry for them. Don't feel sorry for me. I'm not hormonal.
That's right.
I'm just asking the questions.
You're not roaring yet.
No, I will be shortly.
Tasman District Council and Marlborough District Councils run a flow line on their websites, which gives you, the last week's flows. And Tasman's quite good because it'll give you the record flood, the 5-year flood, the 10-year flood. So you get an idea of what size it was. Like, was that the normal average size flood for the year, or was it a 10-year event? I mean, for example, we got a 50-year event 9 years ago, I think it was, around about a 50-year event in the Moch Pico when they just put radio transmitters in trout. And Lawson spent the next 2 weeks digging out those transmitters from under gravel banks, most of them, because the trout just got totally wiped out by a wall of water that came down. So because it came up so quick and it was so big, it just absolutely flattened it. But, an annual flood is probably semi-beneficial if it's cleaning the river out, if it's had a long, low summer of low flows and things like that, as long as it doesn't come up too fast. So really depends on the size. And as I say, we got off really lightly. Like the small streams around the Stoke, Richmond Fan were just horrendous, absolutely thrashed, as were the houses. But a lot of the rivers further inland didn't fare too badly. The Upper Takaka got a bit of a dumping, but.
So when you get a massive surface runoff like we experienced in a localised area, that would actually seriously impact on trout. And what about eels?
Yeah, what they tend to do is they try and move into backwaters and side eddies and things like that as
like
the levels rise.
Up the Ohukanui.
Yeah, and if it's too fast, if it comes down in a wall, they just don't get much of a show at all. Eels are probably the one of the tougher species, so they probably tend to crawl out of it. I mean, they can crawl over land and things like that, as long as they can get out of the boulder meat mincer, they should be all right. But your adult trout tend to, if it comes up really quick like that in a wall, they just don't have time to get out into the backwaters and sort of go out into the stiller areas as it rises. So if it's a 50-year event and it comes down in one huge dollop like that, it absolutely hammers them. But generally they're not. That was just really the small urban streams that did that, and a bit of the Takaka Rawalka system. So
well, it was pretty impressive. I mean, I had people quoting that we had a metre in an hour. That wasn't quite the case. It was about 100 mils or so. So 4 inches in an hour. Now, if you think that is really untoward, just think this again. We've had those years and years and years in a row. They just happen in localised spots. But when we come back, we'll be talking with Reece more about trout.
Crimpy on Newstalk ZB. He is roaring.
Can you roar? Show us your roar. Can you roar up a stag?
Not really.
Can you roar up a trout? Try.
No.
How do you roar a trout?
No, I haven't tried that one either, actually, Daryl.
So we found out that's why you don't go hunting in the roar. It's not because you feel sorry for them, you can't actually roar.
That as well, probably. Yeah, that as well.
Yeah. Oh, damn. Before the break, we were talking about the heavy localised downpours. Now, I remember living in Sissy Bay, we had something like 5 inches in an hour down there. Didn't generate the kind of news because there was only a few people living down there, but it's quite spectacular when it happens in a localised area. Again, 35, 40 years ago, living on the farm at Tadmore, there was one instance where they had a heavy rain at the head of the Tadmore Valley, and we had a wall of water that we watched come down the river that was a good 2 metres high, a flash flood. So these kind of events aren't new, are they, Reece?
No, they're not. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, whether you're, it's climate change or whatever you want to put it to, the last decade we seem to have had a lot of, a big recurrence of a lot of them. Like, for example, if you get a 5-year return flood 3 years in a row, well, your fishery's just toasted, because most trout are only living to 4 or 5 years, and by the time they get to 5 years old, they're a good 5-6 pound fish, mature adult, and they've been spawning several times. So an annual flood is fine, but if you're getting 5 to 10 year floods, every second year, that it starts to really dent the fisheries, and I have observed that here, and we are, I guess some of our fisheries are at a lower level than is optimum. I mean, in the 80s, I think they're in their heydays. We can only hope that we don't get more 50-year floods in the next couple of years, really.
See, we were talking about that earlier on the way to the radio station, that I fished back in places like the Karamea, the Crow and Roaring Lion, places like that in the 1980, back in the heyday, the halcyon days of trout fishing. And people are complaining today that we're really in the doldrums. It's all over Rover, slash your wrists, right in blood to Fish and Game and complaint. Is it as bad as what people are saying? Because when I see Facebook, when I see these youngsters that are out there, I still see bigger fish than I ever caught, and I see plenty of fish still being caught. Yeah,
it's a really hard one to gauge that, Daryl, because certainly you get younger people, as you say, and it's fantastic, and that's the fishing they know. And then you get some of the older generation that kind of remember it back in its heyday in the 80s, and it's not as good as what it was, So it really depends on who you talk to. But I mean, what I do notice is as people get older, they tend to get more negative about fishing generally. Not all people, but
you.
And that probably happens to all of us, I guess. But
you go for a walk in your socks.
And they probably are, part of that is memory. They probably are remembering when the fishery was at its high points, because it's cyclical like all things in nature. It has high and low points. So, and they remember the high points and complain that they're not there now. So. Yeah.
Who wound you up? The older generation, remember that? I have no idea what you just said.
If it's any consolation, I'm nearly there myself.
I'm still prickling. Yeah, go roar a trout. I just wonder though, obviously change is constant. One thing is constant, and you look at the photographs back to the 1930s where you see people with tobacco sticks with trout lined up. We're never going to get back to those days, though, are we?
No, I don't think so, because I think you've probably got 10 times the number of fishermen than you had at least then. And also back in those days, transport, we didn't just jump in the SUV and roar off and we're at the lakes in an hour and a half. In those days it was God knows how long it used to take to get there if they had a car at all. So it was sort of so different then. It's sort of chalk and cheese really, comparison-wise. But certainly there's some amazing early pictures of what some of those fisheries were like, hey?
And I'd just like to point out I'm in none of those pictures. Not even as a youngster.
Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So what can we expect in the future then, big boy?
Well, I just hope that we get a stable. It would be really nice to get a decade, say 10 years, where we just have sort of nothing bigger than a 5-year return flood, and a few years where you're just getting annual size floods, because I'd really like to test this. My own personal view is that flooding is really driving things, and to prove it or otherwise, I'd love to see a stable decade of not massive floods year after year, which seems to be what we've had in the last 5 to 8 years. So,
but I can do that for you.
Yeah, you have to make.
That'd be great.
I was going to say
I can organise that, Reece. I have connections.
Yeah.
So. Just keep me happy, and I'll keep you posted. All right, you've been listening to the young Reece Barrier this morning from Fish and Game on his theories on fishing and where they go and why they do what they do. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Reece. Thank you.
Thank you, Darryl.
Hasn't been that much of a pleasure. Reece is now leaving in his socks. All right, next week we'll be back with more fishing, madness and mayhem. Goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.